Okay, it looks like we've got a good group with us today and people will still trickle in. There is one change to the agenda, and that is the moderator for the panel after Dr. Hansen's address will be Jane Atato, who is at Howard. And Jane is the interim director of REKS at Georgetown Howard University CCTS. I will let Jane go over what all those initials mean when she takes over as moderator. Let's go through the housekeeping again. If you have questions, please put them in the Q&A box. You'll see that at the bottom of your screen, you have an option to submit your questions anonymously. And, oh, look, Jane told me regulatory ethics, knowledge, and what did she tell me? And support, REKS. Got it. Thank you, Jane. And the chat function you can use to request technical support. Thank you again for joining us today on this windy Friday. And it is my pleasure to get us started on our second day of our two-day conference. The emergency use review of vaccines, what it means and how it may impact future approvals. And we're all interested in this topic in our work in clinical and translational research. Stephen Hansen from the FDA has agreed to join us today and kick us off with the keynote. Dr. Hansen has held positions in private industry, academia, and government with over 20 years experience operating in scientific and regulatory environments. Post-baccalaureate, he worked as a research associate in the biotech field. Later, he went on to earn a Ph.D. in neuroscience from Oregon Health and Science University in Portland, followed by accepting a postdoc in molecular neurogenetics. In 2013, he left academia to join the FDA. His work with the agency has been focused in the Bioresearch Monitoring, BIMO, and biologics commodities. As an investigator, he's traveled across the country and around the world, conducting inspections on behalf of the agency. 2 years ago, he accepted a position as a division leader, supervisory investigator in Office of Bioresearch Monitoring Operations, Division 2. In addition to supervising investigators, Dr. Hansen helped develop FDA's National Certification Exam for BIMO investigators. He sits on several committees tasked with data analysis, the development of BIMO inspectional curricula, and is a lecturer at FDA's national training courses. So I'm going to turn it over to you. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Okay, thanks so much, Sheila. Just put it in the chat or something, make sure everyone can hear me. I'm hopefully coming through okay, but I'm using my computer speakers today.
You're coming through loud and clear, so thank you.
Perfect. Okay, yeah, so thank you for that introduction, and thanks for having me here today. An interesting topic, a wide-ranging topic, and this is hopefully not going to be your only introduction to us, but give you a flavor for what emergency use authorization is. So yeah, a little bit about me. Thanks for that introduction. I'm a supervisor in the Bioresearch Monitoring Program. My investigators, my team, we stretch kind of the beltline of the country. So I have people in St. Louis, Kansas City, Denver, Los Angeles, San Diego. So kind of a wide group. And we're field investigators, primarily looking at clinical trials, laboratories, IRBs, that type of thing. But I gave a lecture last month at SOCRA and talking about decentralized clinical trials. And I was asked to also talk about emergency use authorization with your group. So thank you for having me. Let's get started. A little bit of housekeeping from the agency's standpoint. Obviously, this information presented here is for information. It's not meant to supplant the written law or even advice from legal counsel. And should I enter any opinions of my own, which hopefully I don't, those will be my opinions, and they are not meant to be the agency's position. It's not meant to supplant written law, regulation, or advice of legal counsel. So now that we're all on the same page, why don't we jump into it? Starting with the background, and if we'll go to the next slide, please. It's emergency use authorization. It's a broad topic. It's in the news a lot lately, but it may be a little confusing. So I thought we'd take a moment and talk about a little bit of the background. How did we get here? In particular, what is emergency use authorization as far as it's concerned for the American public? But it's really codified in the law, and I don't want this to be just a dry recitation of the law of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act or the Public Health Service Act. So I thought we'd take a little bit of a segue and do some background. How did we get here? What brought us to this point? So we actually have to start in 1906 with the Pure Food and Drug Act. What this was is this is the first modern really the first modern law that was designed to regulate food and drug. In this time in American history, there was a lot of things on the market, and we often call them snake oil nowadays. But it was almost like a guidance. It was very, very toothless. It did not require any sort of formal approval for drugs. There were no necessities for drug manufacturers, drug producers to provide that it was safe and effective. And if there were any action whatsoever to be taken against a drug producer, it was ex post facto to marketing, after the fact. And by that, a company could put whatever they want out on the market. If you'll just go back one sec, they could put whatever they want on the market, and only after people were injured, only after damages occurred, could there be any sort of action at all. And the action was very, very limited. What it centered around was labeling and marketing of it. So fast, 1906, and go forward 20 years to the 1930s. And at this point, it was well known that the Pure Food and Drug Act was rather toothless. As is our general want, not much has changed. There was gridlock in Congress over what should be done about it. Sure, everybody agrees it needs to be amended, it needs to be changed, but what should be done? How strong should it be? What are the dynamics of it? And there was really a lot of back and forth, and nobody could agree on anything. Right up until 1937, and probably everybody knows this story, the Elixir of Sulfanilamide. And just as a quick refresher, the sulfanilamide, the Elixir of Sulfanilamide, it was a sulfonamide antibiotic. It was really, this Elixir of Sulfanilamide was made for children. It was strep throat. It was introduced by the S.E. Massengale Company in mid to late September of 1937. And by early October, there were already floods of hospitalizations and quite a few deaths. 105 people passed away, mostly children. They were poisoned by this. What this was is getting the sulfa drug to dissolve into the solution. The chemist at S.E. Massengale Company, I believe the name was Harold Watkins, he used diethylene glycol to get this to dissolve into the solution. What this did, similar to antifreeze, it destroyed the kidneys. The children passed away from very painful deaths. So this was a quintessential moment. Sometimes when you hear about regulations, you hear that they're written in blood, and this would be a perfect example. As in, people have to die and get hurt, seriously injured sometimes before there's this this inertia, or to break the inertia and act on something. And that's exactly what this did. So if we move forward another slide, almost immediately, 1938, or early 1938, I think it was January, February, Congress passed the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. And that's the act that we have today. It's had several amendments over the years, but this is its first introduction. what this did, the FDCA, it required pre-market approval for drug products. So it wasn't just that drugs could be introduced and then later on we'll see what happens. But in fact, now they have to receive a pre-approval from the agency before they can be marketed. This includes the NDA, the new drug application. The NDA, it requires provisions for knowing about the chemistry of the product, what's going into it. We need to ensure measures of purity, potency, reducibility, and stability. Again, we first see this introduction of clinical studies in both animals and humans. It also provisions inspections of factories that actually produce the drug. And then it briefly touches about medical devices and cosmetics as well. Importantly, and you'll see there, I've put hyperlinks to everything I'm talking about. So this should all be public information, and probably most people know about this already. So if we go forward another little bit, and it sounded good, and everything was good about this. Again, it was a good introduction, but it was not completely there. So moving forward another 20 so years, 25 years, we reach the early 60s, and probably everybody knows about the tragedy of thalidomide. And again, as a quick refresher, thalidomide was introduced, or wanted to be introduced as a antiemetic treatment for morning sickness in pregnant women. The picture I have up there is Dr. Frances Kelsey. She's on the left, and President Kennedy on the right. He's awarding her the Presidential Medal of Freedom. And this is important. Frances Kelsey, she was actually quite a towering figure in FDA history. And I definitely want to put her up there and recognize her. Here, the agency, both the agency itself, actors within the agency, as well as politicians and lobbyists, were pressing really hard to get this drug approved in the United States. It never was approved, and it was because of Dr. Kelsey. She alone was the roadblock. She was a reviewer on this. She kept finding problems with the data of this thalidomide, and so she never did approve it. She was under tremendous political pressure. She's under tremendous agency pressure, all you could imagine, to approve this drug. But she never did. And then this drug was already approved in Europe, I believe in Canada as well, and we started in Australia. And then we started to see that children were being birthed with deformations and missing limbs, and it was tied back to the thalidomide use. So, as I said before, generally it takes tragedy for some sort of action to occur. 1962, the Kiefer-Harris Amendment, it required manufacturer, I should say sponsors, companies, to prove the efficacy in clinical trials. It did a lot of things, but that was the one we want to talk about. Really, you know, as a sidebar, it's not that the medical community, researchers, companies, it's not that they are trying to bring bad product to market. Not at all. But sometimes we don't have all the evidence. And so we do want to take a little bit more thoughtful approach. Certainly when we talk about the Elixir of Sulfanilamide, it's not that Harold Watkins, the chemist for S.E. Massengale Company, he was probably not looking to be a villain of medical history. But, you know, without all of the data, without a proper review of it, that's kind of what happened. Again, as a sidebar, Harold Watkins actually committed suicide after this. I believe he was going to be brought up on charges. So whether it was through not wanting to face the criminal system or through just guilt of his role in this, he committed suicide. It wasn't that he was trying to bring a bad product to market. The S.E. Massengale Company, and I should have said this on the previous slide, they were given only a very modest fine. There was really no violation of the law that the company committed. The only real violation is calling their product an elixir. And by definition at the time, the elixir had to have a certain amount of alcohol in it, and the elixir of sulfanilamide didn't have enough alcohol. in it, in the solution itself. So that's why they were given a modest fine for violations of the Pure Food and Drug Act, because it was a labeling violation. Interestingly enough, and again, just a whole swirl of history, Francis Kelsey was actually a graduate student at the University of Chicago, and that lab was tasked with analyzing this elixir of sulfanilamide to find out what was the toxic agent in it. So she has been around for a while in FDA history, and she's a very important figure. But anyways, let's get back on track. The 1962 Kiefer-Harris amendments, needing to show efficacy in clinical trials, needing to show safety in clinical trials. So go forward another 10 years, and now we're into the 1970s. And we have the medical device amendments of 1976. And this was coming out of medical devices were becoming a much bigger player in the medical market, right? We have things like pacemakers, we have things like intrauterine devices. But we see by the early 70s, failings of pacemakers. We see problems with intrauterine devices. So by 1976, there's the introduction of the MDA 76, the Medical Device Amendment. It requires pre and post-marketing clinical trials and controls. And again, I said in the 1938 Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, medical devices did come under FDA's purview. But again, it was similar to the Pure Food and Drug Act. There wasn't a lot to it other than to say that it is now under FDA's responsibility to oversee. It wasn't until the 1970s that we start to see real enforcement of the medical device industry and, again, safety and efficacy requiring pre and post-market clinical trials. So in the next one, the MDA 76, we see, so if you'll flip to the next slide, requires facilities to talk about adverse events, to report adverse events, it gives the agency the ability to authorize recalls when necessary. It classifies medical devices into class 1, 2, and 3. And it created, for the first time, humanitarian use devices and humanitarian device exemptions. So you're starting to see some early antecedents to, there are some circumstances where using it prior to approval might be judicious. I do have a hyperlink there. It talks a little bit about the medical device amendments. If we go to the next slide, we see a few more, right, I should say, let me summarize here. So with that history, the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act requires that most drugs and certain classes of medical devices receive some sort of prior approval. And to get this approval before it's marketed, the product needs to be proven safe and effective. You see this spans across a lot of commodities, vaccines, medical devices, anything really that moves in interstate commerce, a medical device that moves in interstate commerce becomes FDA's jurisdiction and under the purview of the agency to make these sorts of mandates on manufacturers. So that sounds good. We seem to have a mature regulatory system, and that works right up until the point where we need something done really quickly. And so what we're talking about now are public health emergencies. Going through an approval process, providing all of this mountainous data, it's good. It keeps people safe. It keeps, hopefully it keeps bad products off the market, or it limits their introduction into the market. But what about times where we don't have the luxury to go through all of this? We don't have the luxury of having 5 years worth of clinical trial data. Well, public health emergencies are going to be one of those times. The public health emergency is something that is codified in law, and we'll do a little bit of discussion about the law itself. Public health emergencies, if we'll go to the next slide, there's really 4 ways to declare a public health emergency. And I won't read through each one, but one, a Secretary of Homeland Security can declare a public health emergency based on significant risk or even potential of significant risk for a chemical, biological, radiological, or nuclear agent or agents, an attack like that. So CBRN. In the next one, the Homeland Security, Secretary of Homeland Security. Let's try that again. Secretary of Homeland Security acting under Section 319 of the Public Health Service Act, can declare a public health emergency based on a material threat. The next one would be the Department of Defense, Secretary of Defense. Same thing, a military emergency based on similar things, CBRN, biological, chemical, radiological, nuclear agent, or the threat thereof. And finally, the Secretary of Health and Human Services can declare a public health emergency based on similar things, CBRN, chemical, biological, radiological, or nuclear agent. So this is actually codified in the Public Health Service Act itself, in Section 319 of it. Now, this is very important when we talk about emergency use authorization. Acting through the Public Health Service Act, Section 319, the Secretary can make a declaration of public health emergency. At this point, the FDA Commissioner, acting under the delegated authority, that is to mean the Secretary of Health and Human Services delegates authority to the Commissioner of the FDA. So only now can the FDA make a declaration of emergency use authorization. And this comes out of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, Section 564. So importantly, these are not capricious. These are not just, there's a lot of talk in the media and there's a lot of things going on and hospitals are reporting a lot of problems. Let's declare an emergency use authorization for product X, Y, and Z. It is a very prescribed process. The Emergency Use Authorization Act itself is not super old. It only goes back to 2003. And so it might seem like 100 years ago, but it's less than 20. 2003, this is only shortly after the attacks of 9/11. And also around this time, in the DC area in particular, there were this threat of anthrax and the potential that anthrax is being shipped in the mail. The Department of Defense was requiring soldiers to get anthrax vaccine that had only recently been developed a number of years prior, but not too long prior. Soldiers in the Department of Defense sued the Department of Defense saying this is not approved. This is not approved for this. You're forcing us to, or you're mandating us to get this. Back and forth, back and forth. The Emergency Use Authorization Act was passed in 2003. It was it was passed in 2004 after the events of 2003. And it was surrounding anthrax vaccines. And the idea is that we don't have all of the data on a particular medical product, but we have enough. The totality of evidence suggests that it's going to be more beneficial than negative. And so that's where we first get it. So if we move to the next slide, the Emergency Use Authorization Act, it was modified almost a little under a decade ago. The 2013 Pandemic and All Hazards Preparedness Reauthorization Act. And what that did is it beefed up the EUA a little bit. Here, the Secretary of Health and Human Services does not need to declare public health emergency under all of the strictures of the Section 319 of the Public Health Service Act. But rather, it allows a lot more flexibility for the Secretary of Health and Human Services. Again, though, it has to be HHS that declares the public health emergency before the FDA can authorize any sort of EUA. Among other things, it allows for, rather than actual threat, but a potential threat, as perceived by the Secretary, to declare a public health emergency. It does things that maybe we don't think too much about. It expands the time period that data can be collected for medical countermeasures that are associated with that emergency use authorization. It allows FDA to grant authorization for in vitro diagnostics at point of care, so bedside in hospitals. I did a few other things on the next slide. There's a lot of governmental action in this. It allows for the federal, state, and local authorities to work together. And there is a little bit of a separation between federal, state, local authorities, tribal authorities. But what the 2013 amendment did is it allowed for pre-positioning of medical countermeasures. Medical countermeasures can take a lot of forms. It's not just vaccines. It can be medical devices. It can be prophylactics. It also authorized emergency use for medical products for a wide array of medical products. It included verbiage for expanding dating extensions. So, if a drug is good until date X, it actually allowed for the agency to say, we'll allow this to continue to be used even though it's past its expiration date. And it also provisioned the government, whole federal government, but in particular the FDA, to interact more closely with industry counterparts to develop medical countermeasures. And this is really important when we see how the FDA and the medical community worked together when we start talking about the COVID vaccine that was rolled out. Vaccines, plural, I should say. So going to the next slide. What are we talking about now? Emergency use authorization. That was a long way to get to where we're at now. I think I've represented a few different ways there, 2019 nCoV or SARS-CoV-2, and of course COVID or COVID-19 is what we're talking about now. So initially, January 31st, it was just over a year ago, Secretary of Health and Human Services did actually make a formal declaration of a public health emergency according to all of the strictures of Section 319 of the Public Health Service Act. I put a hyperlink up there. You can read all about this. It is public. This is published in the Federal Register as well. A few days later, on February 4th, there was a determination of the Public Health Service Act pursuant to Section 364 of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. This was actually made by Secretary at the time, so this wasn't even the Commissioner of the FDA. It was the Secretary of Health and Human Services, which is, of course, the agency that the Food, Drug, FDA belongs to. About a month later, the first emergency use authorization was provisioned for medical devices, specifically respiratory devices. As we, the country, the world was learning more about the COVID virus, things needed to be brought up online really quickly. The EUA for respiratory protective devices, this included a lot of things. If we remember, it seems like forever ago, but there were shortages of even face masks. That face masks are considered a medical device, protective medical device. And so making provisions to allow for a whole array of manufacturers to start pumping these out without getting full approval, including everything from a simple face mask to N95 masks to full respirators and a Tyvek suit, you name it. This is when we first see it as March 2nd. By March 27th, so couple of weeks later, 3 weeks later, we now see the first EUAs for drugs, vaccines, biologics. So really going through this prescribed process, even though it is an emergency, it still does need to go through the formal process. There needs to be a determination that there is a need to overlook our standard procedures. Not necessarily to overlook, but to expand our normal procedures. So I'm gonna go to the next slide. Just a quick aside. So we have all these emergency use authorizations in place now. In February and March, primarily in March, we see medical devices, we see drugs, biologics, vaccines giving emergency use approval. What it is and what it is not. It is, on the first bullet point there, it's emergency use of an unapproved drug, medical device, or unlicensed biological product. We get that. It can also be an unapproved use of an already approved drug, vaccine, medical device. So although it might be already approved for one type of indication, emergency use authorization, what it does is allows for using, or I should say, repurposing a drug or a medical device for another application. Anytime there is going to be any sort of switch like that, anytime there's going to be a new use for a drug, or a medical device, it does need to be proven safe and effective for its new use beyond what it was originally approved for. But what an EUA or a emergency use authorization is not, it's not a method to bypass review. So these products are still being reviewed. It's not just a simple third base coach waving everyone home as quick as they can. EUA needs to be authorized for each product. So if we remember, we were getting a flood of respirators and face masks that were coming in from abroad, from international countries. They were each being given an EUA. It wasn't just whatever you can bring in at top speed, do it. If we remember hydroxychloroquine, that was another one that needed a very specific EUA for it. Another thing that it is not, it's not an expedited review for non-public health emergency products. So the EUA that was put into place in the early spring last year, it was for the very specific public health emergencies surrounding the COVID virus. So it was not just a let's expedite everything. Let's expedite acne cream. Let's expedite medical devices, pacemakers. It was very specific to medical countermeasures dealing with the COVID vaccine. So when we go to the next slide, we see that, excuse me, the agency has actually put out guidance documents relating to emergency use authorization. And these predate COVID by a few years. This one is from 2017. And it really lays out what are the agency's expectations, what are the agency's needs in order to meet in order for a sponsor to meet the requirements of emergency use authorization. Like I said, the agency has their obligations, including an actual declaration by the secretary of a public health emergency. Then the commissioner needs to authorize a emergency use authorization. But there are responsibilities on medical product manufacturers as well. And it's laid out here in this guidance document. What are some of the responsibilities that are laid out? Again, it's not just you say you're making respirators, okay, go ahead and get them on the market. There are responsibilities in place for it. So we go to the next slide. Where we're at now, emergency use authorization for products for COVID. There have been 3 vaccines that have been authorized. First one was in, I believe it was December 11th, so just a handful of months ago. In that intervening time, that was Pfizer, and then we've had Moderna, J&J is still being tested, right? Biological therapies, we've had 8 different therapies, including things like convalescent plasma and remdesivir. Medical devices, there have been several medical devices that have been authorized for emergency use. Again, everything from respirators to face masks to you name it. Importantly, and we go to the next slide. Importantly, this is not just, hey, let's see whatever's out there and you say your product is a medical countermeasure, sure, go for it. No, it is a very prescribed process, as I've stated a few times. When we talk about the vaccines dealing with COVID, they actually started, the ones that have already been given emergency use authorization, the clinical trials started for them back in June. And it was in May that that sponsors had product they were ready to test in humans. IRBs were already being notified by it. Clinical investigators were already being set up around the nation, around the world. Phase 1, 2, 3 still counts, phase 1, 2, 3 clinical trials. The sponsor themselves, they do need to submit an application to the agency for emergency use authorization of their product. They need to have safety metrics laid out in advance. It's not just, let's see what happens. It needs to be defined. When we talk about the emergency use authorization for COVID vaccines, there were some things put in place by the agency, including the for emergency use authorization would be authorized. We'd have to have 2 months of follow-up post-vaccine, and in the case of Moderna and Pfizer, post-second vaccine. need to have a minimum of 3,000 participants and the safety data on those. It's not just the clinical trial itself. We also need to ensure that the manufacturing of the vaccine still meets quality standards. It's still being produced in a safe environment. What good is a vaccine that's being produced in a contaminated facility, a facility that has problems with, you name it, they cannot maintain sterility for a host of reasons. That's not going to do anyone any good either. So there are still requirements in place. And we'll go to the next slide. You see in this case, with the emergency use authorization of the vaccines, FDA very publicly broadcast the advisory committees that were meeting to discuss whether to authorize the vaccines for EUA or not. The public meetings were broadcast, I believe, on TV, and you can also find them on YouTube as well. They're up there. Talked about conflicts of interest. They talked about the safety and efficacy of the results that were given to the agency up to that point. The advisory committees talked about the manufacturing controls that were in place. Again, what good is a vaccine being safe and effective if it cannot be produced in large quantities in a safe environment? The advisory committee, they make their recommendations to the senior advisors of the FDA, and then from there it's decided should an emergency use authorization be granted for that or not. So we go to the next slide. There are other plans put in place. So there needs to be continued monitoring of the safety of the product, and that includes monitoring of mortality, monitoring of hospitalizations, serious adverse events, or clinically significant adverse events. All of these are still in place for emergency use authorization. It's not a fully approved product at this point. Again, I put up a hyperlink. You could see all of the things that are put in place that are necessary for continued emergency use for whatever product it is. When we go to the next slide, I put up here that responsibilities are on both sides of the fence, both the industry, but also the FDA and the CDC as well. There's a little bit of a shared responsibility there. They're continuing to monitor for safety signals. These are coming in through MedWatch reporting, through the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System, through FDA's Adverse Event Reporting System as well. And there's a public dashboard specifically for COVID under the FAERS system. Anyone at all, if you've got a computer connection, you can get online and look up all of these. You can look up the data that are being reported in the FAERS system. You can look up, or you can report both as a clinician or as a clinical coordinator or as an individual that has received a vaccine. You can get on and report to MedWatch, or not MedWatch, but the VAERS system. So next slide. Few things to consider about emergency use. It does have a lifespan. The EUA for any given product, it can be revoked or terminated at any point if it's shown to be that the dangers outweigh the perceived benefit of the product. I know I'm trying to think of a couple of things. I'll leave that aside. EUAs can also be merged. So if an EUA has been approved for, let's say, the manufacture of a respirator or respiratory type of system, it can be merged into a couple of different things. It doesn't need to stick with only that one thing, but again, a formal process. When we talk about these medical products, vaccines in particular, the emergency use authorization, it is not the endpoint of the product. Importantly, because when the public health emergency is declared over, that product is no longer, for lack of a better term, fit for use. It still needs to have full approval for continual marketing. So once either the public health emergency is terminated or even the emergency use authorization is terminated, so is the use of that product until it seeks full approval. So that is that's a very broad stroke discussion about emergency use authorization. I think that's my last slide. When what kind of questions do people have? I think we're pretty good on time, but hopefully that gives everyone a flavor. It's probably not going to answer every question you have, and let's see what's out there. Let's see what you got.
Okay, I will thank Dr. Hansen for a very lovely presentation and really loaded with a lot of information. So I hope we'll have some questions here. Let me go to the first questions and see what we have.
And I'll stick with it. I may not have your answer immediately, but I did put my contact information up there. So I'll do my best. I know you're going to try and stump me. If I don't have your answer, put my contact information up there. Go ahead and email me or call me, and we can get you in touch with the right people, or I can find the information for you. So
that is lovely. We got a first question for you. If approval of the current vaccines, Pfizer, Moderna, and J&J, is for emergency use only, can universities, employers, etc. legally require their employees to get the vaccine? How soon do you anticipate full approval of the vaccines by the FDA?
So two questions there. Can they mandate, can private industry mandate their employees getting a vaccine? That's a legal question, not one that I want to delve too far into. When do we think full approval will occur? That's a little bit of a tougher one. There was actually with the rollout of the clinical trials, what was exciting about that is there was a lot of people that wanted to get into clinical trials, and probably everybody knows that recruitment is one of the stumbling blocks for getting a clinical trial, getting through all of the clinical trial. With the COVID vaccine clinical trials, really people were beating down the door to get into the trial, and so probably approval will come quicker than most vaccines, right? Because the data is rolling in very quick, and of course we don't have longitudinal data yet. The first people getting vaccinated, the first study trial participants, I think vaccination started in early August of last year. It may have been late July, but I think early August is when needles first started going into arms. So we don't even have a full year yet. I had imagined we'd want at least a year, but that's also not up to me.
Thank you. See the second question here. It seems like agencies are waiting for EU to be finished before mandating vaccines by employers. Your thoughts?
It seems like
agencies are waiting for EU. I think emergency use to be finished
European
before.
Union. So it seems like the agency, FDA, is waiting for EU, the European Union, before mandating. Maybe we could rephrase that. EU as in the European Union, waiting for them to make a determination before they are mandating vaccinating their employees, or is it waiting for the FDA?
Okay, it's for EUA, I think emergency use authorization.
Right. So the vaccines right now have been granted emergency use authorization. The ones that are being widely disseminated amongst the public. So outside of clinical trials, a lot of public or state health agencies are open to the public to come get the vaccine. Can it be mandated by a private employer? And let me go back to 2003 and the actual Emergency Use Authorization Act itself. The EUA came out in 2004. It was provisioned in 2004, and that was from 2003, the Department of Defense mandating soldiers to get a vaccine for anthrax. The soldiers sued the Department of Defense, saying that this was not the intended use of the vaccine. 2004, the Emergency Use Authorization came into being, and then the Department of Defense was now mandating, because of the EUA, mandating soldiers get vaccinated against anthrax. Now that's the government, right? That's the military mandating soldiers to do something. I don't think it talks about private industry. So if a private employer is mandating their employee get vaccinated, can they do so? And that really is a question of legality, and almost, it gets into contract law and labor law. Is it a function if you're a nurse? For example, my wife is a nurse, and her hospital makes them get flu vaccines every year. Flu vaccines are approved. Now, can they mandate under emergency use? I really think that would come down to contractual obligations between employer and employee. Certainly, the employer could not mandate people enrolling in a clinical trial. Can they mandate under an emergency use? I don't know. I think that gets into sticky legal ground, and I don't want to be the one weighing in on that.
Next question. For emergency use authorization, which steps are missing as compared to full approval?
Which steps are missing? So EUA lowers the level of evidence necessary for full approval. Really, that's what it does. It lowers the evidence necessary to be proven safe and effective. So we're going to have probably a lower N size in the overall clinical trial. So, a clinical trial, it's going to take however long. So what is it right now? Clinical trials can be anywhere from 1 to 5 years. It's going to enroll thousands upon thousands of patients if it's a brand new drug. If it's something that is a modification of something we know a lot about, flu vaccines. We see flu vaccine clinical trials every year as a company is bringing out a vaccine against the new variants of the flu that are going to be prevalent. But we already know a lot about the standard flu. As I said in one of the earlier slides, in order for emergency use, there had to be a minimum of 3,000 study subjects enrolled. And generally, for full approval, you'd need a lot more than 3,000 study subjects. But 3,000 was considered the minimum. Safety metrics were still in place. Emergency use, again, we don't even have a full year. So from, like I said, I believe it was August when the first vaccines for Moderna and Pfizer went into arms, to the point where Pfizer was the first emergency use, and that was December 11th. You're looking at a very short time period, 4-5 months maybe. Generally, for full approval, you'd need a much longer time span to show what are the longer term effects. I think repeatedly you hear in the news that Pfizer, Moderna, they're effective for 6 months. That's because that's the data we have, right? We have 6 or 8 months data. It's not that the effectiveness wears off necessarily after 6 months. It might, but we don't know. We just don't have any data on it. So for full approval, I'm going to imagine that the agency is going to require a lot more longitudinal data, including, when we talk about the vaccine that is being looked at, and there's reports of, is it causing blood clotting? Is it causing myocarditis? What are some of these long-term effects? We really don't know, but the emergency use said the totality of evidence, what we have right now, the benefits outweigh the costs. So for full approval, we're going to need a lot more data. That's really where the differences are, is the N size is going to be a little smaller, the time scale is going to be a little bit shorter. But what we know about it in this, we have some minimum standards, 3,000 plus patients need to be enrolled. That'd be one of them. The benefits outweigh the risks. And I hope that answers your question, kind of a long rambling answer, but it gets at it. And emergency use, it can be tailored to each thing. So in the case of the COVID vaccines, it was 3,000 patients. In the future, it might be something more, it might be something less before an EUA would be given.
Next question. Thank you for this presentation. It seems like many steps were taken to help us become prepared for emergencies such as COVID-19 and other pandemics. Do you anticipate there will be any additional changes to the emergency use authorization process, or do you know of any changes already underway at this time based on our lesson learned? Alternatively, did this process go well as we could have hoped for?
All right, there's a few things to unpack there. You know, did it go as well as we could have hoped for? I think there's always lessons learned. You know, when we looked at that timeline and we looked at what was coming out, and in fact, I was in Taiwan in January of last year, and you know, I'd watch English news stations to see what was going on, and these were the first, you know, really it was becoming internationally. There was the first few reports of this new virus coming out of China, and first it started out as a handful of patients, then a lot more, and then it was well, if you consumed a certain type of thing coming out of a certain type of wet market, then those are the only people affected. By the time I left Taiwan, I was flying back to the States. That was, you know, late January. It was becoming a little bit more prevalent, and we didn't know much about it still. I got back to the States, and shortly thereafter, we start seeing cases in Seattle, and I'm in Salt Lake City. And so it was, okay, well, maybe it was a few things coming in Seattle. And then I had to fly out to San Francisco for work in February. And all right, I was in the Bay Area and I was doing some work, and then they were starting to shut down airports. And I think I left the San Francisco area the day before they shut down the airports, because, okay, it seems to be moving a little bit faster than we thought. So by late February, we now have a public health emergency declared. Should that have been done earlier? You know, maybe history will decide on that. When we talk about actions of the government, we did move pretty quick based on what we were learning each and every day. It was spreading rapidly. We didn't have a lot of good diagnostic tests, obviously, at the time. So lessons learned. I think there will be a lot of lessons learned coming out of this. I told you I didn't want to volunteer opinions. That was my very beginning disclaimer. I'm sure there will be some that are amended or changed or modified as a function of this. Things could have been done better. Yeah, again, history will be the judge of that. Certainly, there was just a lot of confusion going on. And what does this mean for the future? Will we have better sentinel signals, both nationally and internationally, to look for this? The 2013 Emergency Preparedness Act, that again, it provisioned the FDA to pre-stage medical countermeasures. Will that be something that's taken a little more serious in the future? Possibly, maybe not. Maybe it was done exactly as it should have. I'm being a little cagey, a little evasive. I don't want to wade too far into the politics of any of this, but the agency did act fairly rapidly from late February into late March. So hope that answers it. Probably it doesn't, not to your satisfaction, but that's where I'm going to leave that answer.
Next question. How do we respond to people wanting to wait to complete FDA approval before receiving vaccines? Do you have an elevator pitch to assure citizens that full review will be done and vaccines are safe?
That's a great question. It's a question that, you know, my own friends and family ask me, and really, without going through an entire hour-long lecture, but pounding home the point that this, yes, it did move quickly, but it moved quickly through a very prescribed, predefined process. Safety guardrails were in place and continue to be so. Certainly, people have varied opinions on vaccines, but this was not just a kind of slapdash, let's throw everything out there. And this is partially why I presented the information as I did, that the agency does, in order to approve a medical device, it does go through data. It looks at the safety and efficacy of the product. In the case of the vaccines, safety and efficacy are still there. When I talk about lowering level of evidence necessary for safety and efficacy, I was talking about, you know, again, the end size of the clinical trial, the longitudinalness of the clinical trial. And, you know, some of this we might not even know about serious adverse events that are occurring after a vaccine for a little while. It might be a year or two later before we start to find some of these. One of the things that I do tell people, though, is we've got a lot of data. And part of that is there was just a really surge of interest in wanting to enroll in a clinical trial. So even though a standard vaccine might take a year or two to get enough participants to show that we have statistical significance, we can detect these outliers of serious adverse events or side effects. When it comes to these clinical trials, there are so many people enrolled that we are hearing stories about, yes, there may be an association with blood clotting, but that's, and I don't mean to dismiss that, it is a serious thing, but that's a very small fraction out of the thousands, millions that have enrolled. So there's probably a lot more data we have on these than a lot of other vaccines, short-term data, not long-term data. Because we do have so many enrollees. So yes, it's very public what the agency has done. Like I said, the review panel, they put their review committee on the internet, on TV. You can find all of it. My elevator pitch to, again, even friends and family is all the safety metrics are still there. And we do have the benefit of a very large N size, a lot of people enrolled. So we know quite a bit about it, very short term, but I was telling them I'm vaccinated as well, so maybe that eases some of their concerns.
Next question. Could you please give some examples of when a product was unapproved after being granted emergency authorization use?
So granted EUA, and then it was later not approved. Unapproved, or the EUA was revoked. So approved versus authorized, two different things. Trying to think, I believe, and maybe I should have studied up on this more, pre-anticipated this question, but the hydroxychloroquine was initially, I think, given a lot of fanfare and for a wide array of uses, and I think it's been constrained to what uses it's been. So, an EUA, it's not just, as I've said, it's not just you got a product, go ahead and try it. It's still fairly prescribed. You can use it for this indication, for this type of thing. Hydroxychloroquine, it is used for malaria. It was being studied quite extensively for repurposing for COVID infection. Because I'm not overly familiar with this particular application of it, I'll be very careful, but I think it doesn't have quite as broad authorization as it initially was hoping for. As far as something that was given authorization and then later not approval, I can't think of any products for that. But it's a good question. I can get you an answer if you want to email me.
Okay. Next question. We in academia have prioritized regulatory review of research involving Covert during the pandemic, often delaying other important research. Has the same happened at FDA? Are there some great research breakthroughs that happened at FDA during the pandemic that may have overshadowed by our focus on Covert?
Yeah, well, I won't get into too much internals of the agency. Yes, the COVID-19 pandemic was an all hands on deck situation. It's not to say that other important work was not being done. Quite a bit has been. And like I said, my team stretches from St. Louis to San Diego. We've been out and doing our work across a whole array of medical products, medical devices, medical countermeasures, not related to COVID. So, oncology drugs, oncology treatments, or heart stents, that type of thing. So we're still doing all of that, and not related to COVID. But when we do have something very specifically related to the COVID, it does become a very high priority. So are there other things that are not getting done? There are things that are being prioritized, sure. Again, oncology, that's still a very important aspect of the agency's work. Any sort of thing that is life-saving, life-extending, is designed to treat an unmet medical need. Those are all very high priorities. Some of the lower priorities or things that have been deemed lower priorities wouldn't fit into that, right? It might not be a medical product that is life-saving, life-extending. It's not a medical product that addresses unmet clinical or medical needs or some sort of orphan drug product. I won't go into all the specifics. I won't name names. I won't say companies. But a lot of other very important non-clinical work is still absolutely getting done. Yes, it is.
Next question. Finley Covert, 4,000 cases set to expire Thursday, which was yesterday at Pennsylvania Convention Center. What will be done with expired vaccines?
A good question. And I don't know, it might be hinge on the specifics of that. And again, because the EUA for the vaccines, we still don't know too much about it. We have seen, for example, we have seen that, I think it was I forget if it was Pfizer or Moderna, that you can get more doses out of a single vial than initially thought. You know, when a company is talking to the agency, they should be laying out all the specifics, how they're going to package the vials, how they're going to be shipped, how many doses per vial. And so as new information comes in, there may be modifications to the EUA. Again, it's not just do whatever you want, let's see what happens. So if the manufacturer can provide data saying, even though these expire Thursday of next week or whatever, we have data to show that this is still has purity, potency, you name it. This data shows that it has that it can last a week beyond its printed expiration date. The agency will consider that and make a determination. And I know on one of the slides there was talking about the 2013 Emergency Preparedness Act. It does very specifically lay out the agency has the ability to extend shelf life with data. It's not just this, let's extend the expiration date for a month and see what happens. I mean, there needs to be data supporting all of this. But the agency is provisioned with the authority to say, based on the data we have that's been provided to us, we will authorize this to continue to be used beyond its shelf life for however long the data says is still viable. It might be viable for 3 months, but the data says it's only viable for 1, because that's the only data we have on it. So that might come into play.
Next question. As many variants are identified, do you envision more emergency authorization used for more vaccines?
With data to support, yes. That's again a little evasive. It's the similar answer. There needs to be data to support this. So as variants emerge, if we have data to show that the Moderna vaccine is effective against these variants, sure, absolutely. If we have no data to support that, or a new vaccine comes on the market that is, or not comes on the market, is being requisitioned for emergency use authorization against a very specific variant, what are the data that support this authorization?
Okay, one more question. Got 2 more questions. Could you please explain how effectiveness of the authorized vaccines was calculated?
How effectiveness on the vaccines was calculated. So when we hear it's 95% effective, 70% effective, what have you. And, this was a determination made by the companies. So I won't get into all of their specifics, but things to consider. So think of a vaccine clinical trial. It's in healthy subjects generally. It's not in people that are sick. So healthy subject goes in, they get a vaccine, and then monitored. Do they get the flu? Do they get COVID afterwards? So there's the breakthrough essentially, or breakthrough infection. So for those that have been vaccinated, very few people have reported getting sick with COVID afterwards. So that's partially what is considered when we talk about the effectiveness rate. And that's true of flu vaccines as well. This is not statistical magic that is being applied to these COVID vaccines. Is if a person is vaccinated, do they subsequently get sick with whatever? Mumps, measles, rubella, with polio, with the flu. So partially that's something to consider when we talk about the effectiveness rate. What's new? Some of the new things about these Pfizer and Moderna, the mRNA-based vaccines, a little different than what we've traditionally seen. And again, when we were talking about the emergency use authorization, we required a minimum of 3,000 study subjects. Maybe as time rolls by, we see the effectiveness rate drop, or maybe it's particularly effective in the first 6 months, but drops off after that. That's what long-term data is going to provide for us.
Okay. Last question, but not least. You came from a private industry to work in government. What special challenges do you face in government as compared to the private sector?
Boy, that's a loaded question. I've worked in biotech, I've worked in academia, I've worked in government. Each is its own unique entity. Government is, it has very prescribed processes. Sometimes in academia, you could say, hey, let's try this experiment. Let's see if this works. Our grant said we're going to do X, Y, and Z, but let's also throw A, B, and C in there just to see what happens. Maybe we'll get something interesting. Government is exactly like I say, the emergency use authorization process. It has processes that it follows. The secretary determines there's a public health emergency, and then the commissioner can make a determination if an EUA is warranted. And that trickles all the way down to day-to-day stuff, right? This is the process that needs to be followed because this is what's been established. So that's something that's a little new, new-ish to me. I've been with the government now for 8 years in both private sector and academia. You could do things a little differently or just try things just to try it. And now in government, which is probably a good thing. You don't want people just doing whatever they feel like and then having that codified in the law. You don't want someone just capriciously denying an EUA when it probably should have been, or capriciously granting one that the data wasn't there to support it, or anything. You don't want an FDA investigator showing up at your site and just deciding that you've made violations of law when in fact you've done just fine. So yeah, it's very, very structured, very rigid in government.
All right, one more, we still have a few more minutes, so we'll get 2 more questions here. Let me go to that. Since the vaccine is approved for emergency use and yet to be fully approved, did the general public sign a consent form?
Did the general public sign a consent form?
Yeah.
Is that the question?
There's a question. I'll repeat it. Since the vaccine is approved for emergency use and yet to be fully approved, did the general public receive or sign a consent form?
That's a great question. This partially comes out of the 2004 Emergency Use Authorization Act itself. Is if it's not been approved, do persons have to be made aware of its non-approval status? And the answer is yes, they do have to be made aware of it. The forms that are being used, and to my knowledge, not issued by the FDA, but I think state health departments are making people aware that it is emergency use authorization, not approval. So I think that could take a lot of different forms, but yes, the information does need to be provided that it's emergency use.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for such an informational section, Dr. Hansen, and we are so grateful you're here. And thank you much.
Thank you very much for having me. I did put my contact information up there if people want to reach out. And if I didn't answer your question fully, maybe I'll also be cagey in an email response as well. But other than that, thank you so much. I appreciate your time today.
Thank you.